What's up, church family? Welcome back to the Revivalist for Christ channel. I'm your host, Jordan, and today we are starting a very exciting verse by verse study through the book of Romans. I'm super excited for this study. I have been preparing for this study for over a year now. Lots of research, historical, cultural, biblical. I've also worked really hard to make sure that I'm bringing you guys content that no one else on YouTube is bringing you. I have watched several studies all over YouTube with the verse by verse breakdowns to see what they are teaching and also to be able to bring that perspective to you at times and tell you whether or not I would agree or disagree with that perspective. So, if you can think of a popular verse by verse Bible study through the book of Romans, I have probably watched it. So, lots of preparation went into this. I'm super excited to finally be able to bring this presentation to you because I really did think that I'll just gather a couple of notes for the book of Romans and I will just do an introduction. And then I realized just how much of a nerd I am and I went deep. So, some things that are going to be a little bit different about this particular study that you won't really see in other studies is I'm going to put a large emphasis on historical reconstruction. And basically, what I mean by that is going back to first century Rome and bringing it to the 21st century context so we can understand what are some of the things that Paul's addressing. We're going to look at some of those things today as well, but I do think it's important when we are studying anything that we have to acknowledge both the cultural and the historical context of which it's written in. And the reason for that is because this is written to a specific audience at a specific time for specific situations. And I think one problem that a lot of evangelicals in particular, but also other, you know, theologians, if you will, make is they try to bring their theology into every text. And that's not going to work if we're being honest with the text. So I really do think that we need to approach each phrase with an open mind of what it's actually talking about rather than seeing what we can extrapolate from that text and bring into the 21st century. Another thing that we are going to be doing is we are going to take an analysis of other popular interpretations, whether it be from those YouTubers I just mentioned or from other prominent figures who have headed theological movements such as Wesley, Calvin, Arminius. We're going to be looking at how they interpret some of these scriptures, and I'm going to tell you what I may agree with or what I may disagree with. So that way we can also, as the text progresses, we can handle it from different points of views and address why I feel the text may or may not be saying that, and also handling proof text apologetically. So as we progress, whether it's a cult, whether it's a religious system, I am going to be addressing proof text as we go through. That way, you guys can be equipped apologetically. Another thing that we are going to be doing is taking a look at how church history has addressed these texts in the past. And I'm going to be telling you about what may have influenced that, what canons they may have had. I'm going to be addressing whether or not I feel that there was a full understanding at that time and why they would be interpreting like that, who their teachers were, and what has stuck and became more of dogma in time. Also, one thing that I'm so excited about, and again, this could probably just be the nerd in me. I am planning as much as possible. I don't know if I'll be able to find them all, but I want to bring up the manuscripts that we use to interpret Romans so you guys can see exactly what the manuscripts look like that we have today. And that way, people who come with you with the argument oh, the Bible's been corrupted or it's been messed with, you guys will have this as a wonderful resource to fall back on. Also, the final thing is we are going to take a look at the goals established in the letter by Paul in the rhetoric, argumentative skills that he used that often get overlooked. So, a lot of exciting things to dive into, guys. It's going to be a very, very thorough study. I worked very hard on it, and I really do hope that it's something beneficial to you guys. Something that will be available each lesson will be a study guide that goes through all the notes and stuff that I address in that particular session. And I do not believe in charging for anything that God has given me to do. So there's always going to be a free copy available. But in the event that you guys want to support the ministry and also support the work to do further research and be able to dive in and do this with future books because this costs quite a bit of money, guys, with buying resources, books, historical classes. Like I said, it's been over a year, so there will also be an option to purchase a copy at a donation amount for the ministry. But for those who can't do that, it is perfectly okay. There will be a free copy available each and every week. I'm not sure if I will have something for this particular video, but if I do, it will be in the description box below. So just taking a look here, I think the first thing I want to kind of go over are the goals that Paul has in this letter that I have seen. Now, a lot of people have kind of commented on the obscurity of Romans that no one really knows what he's talking about, or some people have said, oh, it's just a gospel presentation. I don't agree with either of those personally because the people he is writing to are already the saved converts of Romans. We see that their faith was preached around the world, but that's not to say the gospel presentation isn't in there. But I personally see quite a few motives in Paul's writing. So I'm definitely going to be addressing those. Now, this letter is unlike a lot of other Paul's letters, and I think anybody who's approaching this for the first time can see that for themselves. What we see in a lot of other Paul's letters are very situational letters, sometimes written to a very specific people or a specific person, whereas this is definitely a much more broad letter written to several churches in Rome. And we're going to get into what those church structures look like. But I think it's important to remember that Romans is kind of own its own thing. Sort of like the book of the revelation of Jesus Christ is its own thing. I don't think we can quite pair Romans together with other books in the scripture. And that's just my personal opinion and I'm going to lay out why. But first, going into some of the motives that Paul had. The first, and I feel one of the most overlooked things, is that Romans is it's basically a letter from an ambassador in order to persuade his writers to let him set up camp and gain support to be able to fund and provide resources for his mission trip to Spain. And I don't hear a lot of people talk about the mission trip to Spain or who the barbarians are, but I do think that's very important because it brings a lot more context to Romans because we have references of the barbarians in there. As far as who the barbarians were, they were a large portion of them are in Spain, and these are basically just people who were incapable of supporting civilization for themselves. But we hear Paul talking about being a debtor to both the Greek and the barbarians. And so I think it's very important to understand what was going on historically in Spain, who were the barbarians, what was Paul trying to accomplish. It's definitely important for us to realize that with Paul and his mission efforts to Spain, he had a lot of things working against him. First of all, there's really no historical evidence of a real heavy Israel population like there was in Rome until about the 3rd or 4th century. So he wouldn't have been able to start with a group of people who are already incentivized to look into the prophecies present in the text of that time that would have pointed to this messianic figure. That means that there also would be an absence of synagogues. And with an absence of synagogues, Paul wouldn't have his normal vehicle that he used in evangelizing because Paul oftentimes fell back on the synagogues as a place to step up and have his presentation share the gospel with people. And also, being that none of these religious connections were there, and also none of these Christian converts were there, it would be very hard for him to establish crucial connections. And that's why he was trying to set up a base in Rome. That way, there was a place close to Spain. All roads lead to Rome. And it allowed him to minister to Spain, but also have a camp to fall back on as sort of a base for his missionary journey to Spain. Another thing to take into account is the likely language barrier between those in Rome and those in Spain. So it would have required Paul coming in contact with a translator. Also, something that historically needs to be accounted for, since Paul was a Roman citizen, we need to remember the Carthaginian conflict that happened, where Rome basically invaded Spain, conquered Spain, and they were attacking several indigenous groups for about 200 years. So there was kind of this conflict, and we even see it in the Bible between Rome and conquered nations where people didn't really like Rome. They were kind of like the bully on the playground, and being a Roman citizen could have possibly created some tension. So I would say that is the first thing that we need to take into account is Paul is trying to gain support so he can advance a missionary trip to Spain. The second thing is we can see in this letter that there's a diplomatic approach to minister to both the Jew and the Gentile, the weak and the strong in faith. And the reason for that is because there was this growing tension, between the two. The Gentiles were thinking that they were better, that they somehow replaced the nation of Israel. The Israelites present were very hostile towards the Gentiles because they they didn't see them as meritorious of the covenants. They were the chosen people from the beginning. They didn't like the fact that Gentiles were coming in. And so the two sides were at conflict, and Paul needed to diffuse that conflict. He needed unity in order to establish his message and bring it to Spain. So if these two sides were bashing against each other, he wouldn't be able to effectively plan his missionary journey. So Paul really did want to establish the Gentiles as legitimate believers, but also giving the Israelites in that time their dues and showing that they were the ones of the promises and the covenants, and God hasn't forsaken them. And it really does address the pride. We see this primarily in Romans 9 through 11 of both parties and kind of the arguments that would have been presented. But he also had this fear that the tension would have escalated to the point where the Christian converts from Israel and the Gentile converts would not fellowship with one another. And being that Rome and the churches in Rome had such a prevalent message or a prevalent view that they were the ones spoken of all throughout the world, he didn't want this disunity to get out. It definitely would have promoted divisions very early on. But I also think, in addition to this, there was a tension in the Israelite believers where they not only were coming to terms with Gentiles now being partakers, but they also noticed this tension of so many of their fellow kinsmen, according to the flesh, are not accepting Jesus as their savior. So Paul is balancing that as well while showing the law was just a shadow of good things to come, pointing to Jesus, and the law is never a means of justification. And this is where we get his argument presented of justification through faith alone in Jesus Christ. The third thing is this does act as an attempt to convert non-believers, especially non-believing Jews, but also non-believers of any kind. We see just how strong the impact of Romans has been in so many evangelical circles when it came to sharing the gospel and leading people to Christ. The fourth thing is it did give Paul a chance to clarify his theology because if you guys remember, Romans wasn't a group that was actually founded by the apostles. So it really gave him a chance to present his theology, which is why a lot of people do credit it as having a gospel presentation. But at the same time, it was more so a refining of his theology. It was kind of like a lot of theologians will refer to this as kind of like the first work of systematic theology. And the final thing is, Paul was trying to provide an apostolic foundation for the churches in Rome. And that's primarily because, again, they were not founded by the apostles. There are arguments present that Peter, or at least those who were present at Pentecost, went and founded these church at Rome, but there wasn't a strong apostolic foundation. And so Paul was trying to make sure that they did have something to fall back on. Now, one of the most exciting things for me personally, as somebody who enjoys looking into people's arguments, breaking down people's arguments, looking at debate, is the rhetoric style that Paul employs in this letter. And I think one thing that I don't really hear a lot of people talk about is the rhetoric Paul uses. So I want to take a look at some of the things that Paul uses. Now, this isn't a final list. I'm sure we will find other things as the series progresses, but these are the things that I see at first glance. So the letter definitely has this hope of persuasion for the aforementioned reasons. And so rhetoric skills, especially in ancient Rome, were very important when it came to being able to persuade people. So some of the things, and this one, let me just start with saying that one of the most prominent things we see used in all of Paul's writings is Old Testament citations. And, that's to show that there is a foundation in scripture. It also shows that the Old Testament prophecies have been fulfilled in the new covenant and also fulfilled through Jesus Christ. And for this study, we are going to be looking at those citations through the lens of the Septuagint because the Septuagint was the widely used text of that time. The vast majority of people spoke Greek. It was actually called Koine Greek, Koine for common. It was the common language. So we'll be revisiting those quotations and also looking at the context in the Old Testament and seeing why exactly is Paul quoting that? What is his point? Another thing that Paul does is he cites a lot of creedal formulas, hymns, benedictions, doxologies that were used in the early church. And a lot of people who hop into Romans for the first time Don't know to look for these early church creeds or hymns or doxologies, but we're going to be looking at what those are, where they came from, and also why is Paul quoting those? And a lot of times it is to be able to align with various sides. You know, again, there was some division present in the Roman churches, and this was a way to unify them and relate to them. Another rhetoric skill that Paul falls back on is actually called a diatribe. And so I want to just read a definition of this. This is actually something we still have today. So a diatribe is a competitive argumentative technique suitable for the refutation of contrary points of view in the defense of the author's viewpoint. So very common in debate settings, and we see this happen quite a lot with Paul's letter. He's definitely presenting several arguments. I would say that there's at least four major arguments that Paul presents in Romans. But something that also Paul employs is specific to Jewish argumentation, and that is called a midrashim. And basically, what that is Jewish argumentative form, usually consisting of main text that is explained and interpreted by the second temp or the second text. So the Midrashim basically was something that was employed by the Jewish leaders and other Jewish people who were presenting a theological argument in order to elicit a response from the reader or the hearer. So we'll be looking at some of those. I'll be pointing those out as we come into contact with them. We see a lot of examples used where Paul is equating one instance a lot of times, and if not all the times in the Old Testament, how one instance relates to the second instance and how the truth is consistent throughout. I would say a good example of this is how Abraham was justified by faith. Oh, this one's interesting, and we see this in, I believe it's Romans 3 as well as Romans 9 are two examples that come to mind, but it's called speech and character. And basically, what a speech and character does is it kind of creates this character, and this character is provided its own voice, and basically, it's this opposition to the author, this imaginary opposition. You kind of see this when Paul is asking a question on behalf of the likely improbable opposition and giving an answer to that. Another thing is syllogism, and there's kind of different forms of this. Just reading the definition for you, a syllogism is a fully developed logical argument with all parts present, usually with a major premise, one or more minor present premises, and a conclusion. We kind of, I mean, if you've gone to American public schools, they kind of teach you to write in this format. There are kind of alterations to this and not full syllogisms present in the text. But we're going to be taking a look at exactly how that breaks down here in a little bit. But next thing that I want to look at is the key information about Romans. So when it comes to Romans, there's just a couple of things to establish right up front. Who's the author? First of all, it's Paul. We're going to be talking a little bit about Paul and why he was called and what his ministry was to the Gentiles in next week's broadcast. But I mean, one thing to know about Paul is he was a Roman citizen. And this was kind of like the climax of his ministry to be able to go to Rome and be able to teach and preach the gospel at Rome. That was just something that he really wanted to do as a Roman citizen, just like his heart went out to his Jewish brothers and sisters. This There's some debate of when this letter was written. I actually have one of my study Bibles here to kind of see. I actually have two of them open to see how they do the dates. And right around 57 AD to 58 AD is what they are aligning it as. Now, in my research, I see that Paul likely wrote this letter during, I believe it was it spring of 57 AD or fall of 57 AD? That might be something that we discuss in the future, but just know it's latter half of 8050 where this was written. And the theme of this letter, the overarching theme, is how the righteousness of God is able to penetrate this wicked world, bring righteous to fallen men, how the grace of God is able to have victory over the sin in this world, and also act as a confirmation to the promises given to Israel and showing the fulfillment that Jesus Christ was the Messiah that was promised all those years ago to be the Redeemer, not just of them, but also the Gentiles, by which this ministry has now been expanded to. And Paul has been called to be an apostle to those Gentiles. Now, the audience, we're probably going to be looking at this quite a bit throughout. The audience and the structure of the Roman churches, I think, is very important to understand. And obviously, we know they're Romans, but some things that I feel like we don't understand is, well, first of all, the Jewish and Gentile dynamics. At the time of this writing, it was primarily Gentiles. Now, a little bit of a background, and I'll try not to go on a whole rant about this, but 41 80 80 41, what was happening was people were able to infiltrate synagogues, and the Roman officials couldn't infiltrate the synagogues and bring order to the disruptions that were occurring between the Jew and Gentile entrants. So in AD 41, they said no more synagogues. And then in AD 49 is when the Edict of Claudius went out and basically banned all the ones that were causing this tension, primarily the Jewish Christian converts from Rome. And then this allowed a primarily Gentile explosion basically to happen with Gentile converts. And so you have these Gentile believers rising up in Rome and spreading so quickly, and they weren't observing the religious feasts and everything that were held so dear to the people of Israel. So when Claudius died in AD 54, these Jews begin to go back to Rome, now completely outnumbered by Gentiles and a group of people who were no longer observing what they knew to be the Christian faith. And so it created all this tension between the two parties, and Jews were largely outnumbered at this point. And so Paul was writing to address these concerns. Another thing that I do want to look at is the structure. So, since there were no synagogues, they had several house churches. Now, something that a lot of people don't realize is the majority of the people who were early Christian converts were actually slaves. And so, when looking at the housing situation, they weren't the best conditions. There was no one set congregation. There were multiple congregations. Sort of, I guess, what you would kind of see throughout any town now with the various churches, but they would be more centralized to homes, and those homes would not be in the best condition. Slaves were in one of five categories. They were either captured enemies in the war, they were people who voluntarily sold themselves into slavery for economic reasons, they were people who fell into debt and lost their freedom. There were certain classes of criminals that were punished by enslavement, and also offsprings of slaves. And just hearing some of that language, you can see why it's probably good to understand what these certain categories are of slaves once we get into Romans, because we're going to see Paul uses a lot of language that these people would be used to as slaves. But the thing is, the slaves we can't we can't look at slavery like we know slavery to be today, especially in the 21st century Western world. Slavery of that time was just an expected way for the economy to run. Not even the slaves would have questioned it. No one could really imagine an economy without slavery in it. So having a gospel message come forth that completely threw out the honor system that was so important to the Roman civilization, briefly touching on that. So basically, the Roman Senate would hand out awards and all that, and it would kind of it would give you your ranking in society. But slaves actually had no way of ranking in that system whatsoever. But having a gospel message that now puts slaves on the same level as these Roman officials and the elite in the society, as well as saying that they were all in equal need of a savior. It kind of threw out this system that the world knew at that time, and it required a metanoia, a repentance, to realize that this man-made structure is not how the heavenly economy works at all. So it's very important to take into account what those dynamics would have looked like and how people who were not following after, or people who were not slaves, would have heard this message. When it comes to the arrangement of the letter, we start with what's called the exodorium. That's basically the introduction of the letter. This is in chapter 1, verses 1 through 12. And this basically establishes a relationship or rapport with the reader. Then you have the narratio. This is basically the background information for the issue in discussion that's takes place in chapter 1 as well, primarily from verses 13 through 15. Then you have the propositio, and that is the heading of the proof section. This is the large body of text that goes into the several arguments. Again, I believe there are four major arguments present. I'll get to that in a minute. But so the propositio basically was the thesis statement before getting into the probatio, which is the middle section, the section of the arguments. Now, where I divide the four arguments are in chapter 1, verses 18 to about the end of Romans 4. This is where we see the lineup of all have sinned. So, Gentiles, you're in the wrong. Jews, you're in the wrong. All of you have sinned. We all need justification. That justification comes through faith. And then we see what are the results of that justification in chapters 5 through 8. We see this idea of imputed righteousness through faith and leads up all the way to the guaranteed promise of the glorification of the believer, the eternal security of the believer, as well as other spiritual realities such as circumcision of the heart and other things that I personally feel get overlooked in a lot of religious circles today. And then you have the dialogue in Romans 9 through 11, why the promises of God have not failed, despite a majority of national Israel being in unbelief. And we can see that that unbelief is a partial hardening until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. But Gentiles don't get puffed up because just as the natural branches weren't spared, if you don't continue his goodness, that you won't be spared it either. We'll get into that text down the road. That is not a salvific text that people have made. It's clearly talking about individual or on a corporate level rather than an individual level. And the final one is just the primarily from, I would say, chapter 12 to about 15, and that is just conduct of a Christian. Now we have what's called the period the peroration, and this is basically a summary of the argument. and it's a final emotional appeal to the listeners. This we see in the second half of chapter 15, primarily verses 14, all the way to chapter 16. Now, there are a couple sections of 16 that are cut out for the refutatio. This is the rebuttal of any opposing views. That can be found in verses 17 through 20, as well as verses 25 through 27. So that's basically the arrangement of the letter. And it's also important to realize that Romans was formatted for delivery and memory. One thing that was very important in Greco-Roman culture was being able to speak without notes. Unlike me, I need notes. So I would not have done well in the Greco-Roman world. But there were several techniques that were taught for people to be able to memorize their speeches, deliver speeches in a way, write speeches that are easily memorable. And so Paul definitely would have been very equated to the epistemological principles needed to be able to write a letter that not only would be able to be portrayed by anyone who's reading it with emphasis, but also be able to be retained by those listeners. So, and I think the other thing that's really interesting about Paul's writing style is it always elicits a response and a participation of the listener. And it does that even today. I just think that's amazing writing. So I think it's important to measure what it would have sounded like to the first century reader, as well as what kind of participation it would have invoked at that time. So we'll be looking at that as well. Now, style is something that's very important to a writing, but when it comes to style, there is just so many different stylistic approaches that Paul employs. I We see a lot of parallelism in here. That would probably be one of the main styles, but as we progress, we're going to go into the several styles that Paul employs for certain verses or set of verses. So that would be a bit much to go into at the moment. I think it would be best to just address the style of writing as we approach each verse and see the style that Paul would have used. Now, as far as some important cultural and historical context to remember is not just what we went over with the tensions between the Jews and Christians, them being primarily slaves, their living conditions. I think something else to take into account is a lot of the programs that were being implemented in Rome at that time. Rome was a great city, and there were a lot of perks and benefits and things that were being built at that time. But the readers of this letter would not have been beneficiaries of that, largely due to the fact that they were slaves. Also, another thing to remember are civic cults. They were basically people who idolized their religious lead or not religious leaders, their political leaders of that time to the point of making them gods. The culture relied heavily on their ability to boast, which is kind of why you see some of this tension between Jews and Gentiles. Boasting was very prominent in that culture, and all of a sudden the gospel message relieves anybody from being able to boast at all. And we see that emphasized so heavily by Paul that this isn't something you can boast in. It's not of you, it's for the glory of God. And everybody is not only put on an even playing field, but they can't even boast about anything they merit. And so this was just completely contrary to the world that they knew. That does it for the introduction of the Roman series. Be sure to join us next week where we will dive into chapter 1, verse 1, and start to tackle the contents in the book of Romans. If you guys are interested in joining us live, there is a Q&A available each week where I will take your questions live and answer them. So thanks for tuning in, guys. Be sure to give this a like and subscribe if you are not already subscribed.